Welcome and thanks for pressing play to listen to my presentation regarding performance assessment design, implementation and refinement. The subject I'm sharing with you today sits as part of a transdisciplinary elective that's offered in initial teacher education at the University of Technology, Sydney. My reflexive practice has brought to light that at several junctures, adult educators need to instinctively interrogate their roles, the methods that they use to implement their subject content, and the stance they take about what is important to forge on with, what is valuable to refine and adjust, and what you can really just let go of in the pursuit of best e-design and online delivery practice. To share my findings with you today, my presentation goes through 5 different points about performance assessments in an online space. I begin with how I started figuring out what I was going to do, how I was going to do it, and then in response to some issues, I found solutions to implement as lessons learned in the first and second reiteration. At this point of my presentation, I'd like to acknowledge the growing demands for flexible delivery options and the increasing numbers of students that are enrolling in online courses for higher education. I also acknowledge the impact of the zoonotic virus as part of that, and the ongoing challenges of moving forward to live with COVID, particularly the changes in the education sector, which I believe have sped up options and demands for online learning trends. I begin by acknowledging the influence of transactional distance theory on my thinking and direction. In fact, the instructional design commenced in late 2019 when the university was implementing new tools, being the Canvas platform, and I accrued a fund grant to support the purposeful design of this subject. The subject was accepted as part of the funding because we sought to address the growing number of pre-service teachers that were being engaged in full-time employment prior to their graduation as a teacher in both undergraduate and postgraduate initial teacher education degrees. The structure purposefully allowed the participants to complete coursework asynchronously while retaining the course content rigor. The only usual restriction was completing the coursework and the performance assessments within a semester study cycle. I'll dig into that a little later. As with backward design, I'll start with the end in mind and talk with you about the results. You can see the table on the screen that outside the variance of the participant feedback survey over from 2020 to 2022, there are particular upward trends in regards to enrolment numbers, in regards to the effect of learner-to-learner and learner-to-facilitator interactions, and learner content interactions. We also see an upward trend in course satisfaction in the student feedback surveys. As the amendments were made with solutions that came from the issues in the first reiteration, we could see an upward trend in the participants' perception of their learning opportunities and the quality of the subject and relevance for their future teaching. Quite significant upward trends. I considered 4 key aspects in my design that came from a body of literature, and the synthesis of this literature, which you can read more about in my paper, addresses 4 key points. The first is the critical nature of providing course design features and designed-in learning. That is, visually, logical, organic content flow, uncluttered presentations that enables clear content learner interaction. This was important because of the autonomy and the asynchronous kind of aspect of the subject, and it was important to maintain the balance between high challenge and high support. The second critical aspect was system quality. This was to ensure a smooth learner-content interaction that provided access to free tools, current tech tools that were available and easy to maneuver independently, and it required some back-end maintenance to make sure those external links were working and that the learners were being taken to the right place in the minimal amount of clicks possible. The third priority was all about course content. I mentioned to you before about rigour, and this is really about providing quality and career relevant course content, irrespective of whether it be face-to-face or an online content. The fourth area that was critical to consider was the different types or forms of interaction that the learner would be participating in. And that is the interaction between the learner and the content on the page, the opportunity for learner-to-learner interactions, albeit on an online asynchronous subject, and the types of transactions that the learner would have with their facilitator. And the fifth priority, which I can say at this point was under thought, was the technology, competency and capacity of the participants to integrate these tools for their educational experience. This aspect will and was and will remain an unpredictable variable in and across the course implementations, and I'll address this further later on in the presentation. Let's just go to this slide here where I've illustrated the course design visually. You can see from the linkages that it replicates the teaching, learning and assessment cycle that teachers use in their teaching practice. My aim was to model best practice that they could learn from and use in their career. Central to the cycle, which is the white circle in the middle, is the alignment with the university standards and the educational requirements in Australia, the national curriculum and the state-based reiterations. And the interlinking of the teaching, learning, assessment and curriculum was central and balanced to make sure the coursework was relevant and approved. As such, the coursework modelled the relationship transparently. It linked the intended curriculum outcomes with what was taught and how it was assessed. You might like to press pause on the recording and take time to read some of the examples on the screen, but I won't read through them to you. I'm going to move on though and spend some more time taking you through the learning design system. To do this, I've provided an outline of the learning design in the table on the screen. And I draw your attention to column D. You can see here that there are different e-learning spaces that replicate the type of synergy or interactions that will be taking place. And I've termed these from the terms I found in research with around a campfire. And this includes listening to short chunks of subject content from the content expert. Then there's an in the cave component where participants are practice and they play in e-learning sandpits. They might be using interactive H5P tools, such as, but not limited to, some social polls, a multiple choice quiz, perhaps using some dialogue cards, interactive books, and even some drag and drop closes. One of my favourites was the interactive videos, which then stopped the video, provided a provocation and some points, and students or participants could write notes from that. The learning sequences flowed from presenting new information around this virtual campfire to guided explanations with invitations to participate at a watering hole, as well as completing in the cave prior to submitting a performance into a task basket. At the watering hole, these were asynchronous kind of blog posts where participants posted questions and interacted with each other's comments online. We'll talk about that in terms of an issue that came up after the first reiteration. You can see in column D, though, that this structural chunking allowed self-paced engagement that was with some kind of structural familiarity and predictability. I then draw your attention to columns A, B, and C, starting with column A. And you can see that it's engaging with a particular module design. If you transfer across to column C, you can see that the overarching module is separated into conceptual chunks, and I've labelled them as 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 in this example. And I have a suggested pacing guide in column B to show and indicate to participants how long it's expected to take. In this degree, it is 3 hours per week, so each task is 1.5 hours, and the task basket, which is up to an hour, contributes to their assignment time. Again, giving a replication, structural familiarity, and confidence in manoeuvring across the site was the intention here. This slide shows you how I moved and progressed from one module to the next with the system level procedures that were repeated. And you can see at the end of the second module, there was a participation in a low hurdle multiple choice as an assessment as learning, and that actually unlocked module 3. When I tried that as an optional quiz at the end, we had less than a third of people actually engaging in the quiz, but the low hurdle task was one that opened up that following module and gave me a feed into how students were going with their learning, and then I could feed back and put in some additional work in the second and third module. You can see at the end of the third module that there was a low hurdle multiple choice, but that basically was a yes or no, I have submitted my assessment to, and that unlocked the final survey component. This screen shows you a couple of examples of the campfires. On the left, we have a recorded presentation, and I also had a number of demonstrations of classroom practice as they moved into the watering hole after that initial campfire input. And then you can see there that there's a module 1.4 capture this. This activity was an interactive type of task where they could practice using the visual categories and elements, and that contributed to the task in the e-performance assessment. On this page, you can see 2 examples of performance assessments. You can see the task basket, the links that I provided, basically the recipe of instructions of what they needed to do to complete this task. And then going around the page, you can see the top right shows an example from a previous student on one of those Vox Pops. It's not actually the capture this, but it's a Vox Pop. And then down the bottom left, you can see an example of a student's e-performance assessment. And on the right, again, Anthony's another example of a character profile. His major was English, and therefore he was able to adapt the concepts and the content to suit his future teaching context. So some of the issues, well, as with any learning design, evaluating and refining is needed as we identify the strengths and address the challenges, because we know that success is not a constant flourishing ecosystem. I came up with 3 overarching issues that I addressed and have over the last few years. And what was a carefully considered design process, and it was purposely built as asynchronous, there were still areas that needed to remain fluid, and I needed to be able to adjust them according to meet the diverse learners in the group each semester. The first issue was related to the learner content interactions. The less confident students were for taking risks, the greater the impact had on their perception about the standard or the level of challenge expected of the course. It also impacted on the amount of time that the students took to complete the tasks and to explore the different tech tools. because not all students enjoyed the freedom to innovate and be creative, and this looseness created degrees of comfortability for learners, realising that there were some confusion in the tasks and that some students unable to put that in words on a blog were struggling with. The second issue was related to learner content as well, and this was about the time allocation. It seemed that the less experienced, as I said, the greater the time allocation was required, and this reflected on the course quality rather than on the learner capacity. Something else to consider in future types of surveys and research. And the third one was related to the level of facilitator and learner interactions. Students preferred in-time clarification during their learning process, and particularly in completing their e-performance assessment tasks. And they preferred to do this with one-to-one feedback rather than posting questions to a public blog or a forum, and they were uncomfortable in being honest with what they were being challenged by when others in the course were reading their queries. And although the intent of this was to be able to have a shared practice and encourage learner-to-learner facilitation, it actually had the negative result where I was receiving lots of emails as if it was texting because they really required this in-time feedback. So what are my solutions? Well, the first were doable solutions that could be implemented at the time of the feedback, which happens in week 3 of the course, and then those that were practiced and those that were worked well to be able to make more formal reiterations in ongoing implementations. The first impact that was positive in regards to solution was reducing the number of task baskets and reducing the number of steps within each performance assessment to reduce the task complexity. And in doing so, it reduced the design requirements. I also provided a number of templates. You can see on the screen here that there's a template regarding character profiling, and also I provided templates using different graphic organizer tools and then giving examples for critically analysing particular websites. I found that providing too many choices increased the time that students required to explore the different choices and options before making a decision and then engaging in composing their e-performance assessment. So I'd say here that I opted really for quality over quantity, for relevance and applicability over generality, and innovation over replication. Here are some of the examples of the increased scaffolding that I included as one of the solutions to increase learner content interaction. The first is, we'll start with the left, top left. It's a still infographic that is an example of a performance task that they had to use using the visual meta language and a number of deluxe colour cards, which I won't go into the actual activity here for purpose of time limitation. The second is an series of instructional steps that I made as an infographic, and the poster included instructions on how to compose a book review as if a teacher recommending a text for close study in various contexts. And the third, which is on the right side of the screen, were a series of instructional videos for creating a performance assessment, and in this case it was an iMovie. And down in the bottom left was a pacing guide. Students found the asynchronous and plasticity of being able to complete the subject when they felt difficult without some kind of guidance and pacing. It was optional, but I found that the majority of students actually used this. The next solution worked towards increasing the synchronous in-time learner facilitation and learner facilitator interactions. And I offered weekly and optional in-time drop-ins. I called these watering holes. And the focus for the agenda of the watering holes was sent out a day before the the watering hole timing just as an announcement to allow students to decide whether the content was going to be relevant for them for that particular week. And at these drop-ins, I encouraged a sharing of the performance assessments that were in progress, offered opportunities for each other to comment and offer suggestions and, critically analyse and give praise to particularly good components of the performance assessment, to try and build this capacity of collaboration and working together that teachers need to do in their future teaching practice. You might like to press pause and take a read of how I organised that drop-in and also some of the comments from students' emails in relation to the solution I undertook. I also included 3 types of cohesive links using an asynchronous facilitator and learner interaction. What I wanted to do was to create this spoken-like language that we often use in oral conversations, as if to mimic the presence of me as the facilitator as like a guide on the side walking along with the learner. The first example is a linkage that points learners forward to the next step. So it lets them know what they are about to participate in, what are the key elements they need to be considering, and what it's going to focus on. So it just sort of gets them ready. It foregrounds it. The second example recasts in a different mode. So after they've completed a particular element, it explains it in a different way or provides a different application. And the third example I have as Pocket Point, and I call these recapping opportunities that provide the important information that they have just listened to, and perhaps in the example on board, some of the links directly to particular educational online resources. I call these thinking spaces the in-betweens, and it was these spaces that had the most impact positively on student engagement, satisfaction, and learner outcomes. They're similar to like a thread that you use to sew material together. They acted like a guide on the side or the leader at the front of the trail, walking and taking lead in that. The words that I created and the different linkages in between each learning component bound that teaching, the learning, and the performance assessments into a much more workable composite. And what it ended up with was this second layer in the learning design system. And it purposefully increased the learner-facilitator interactions, reducing this transactional distance that e-learning can often create, the distance that is greater between the actual presenter and those in the learning, and particularly with other learners. You can see on the screen here that the teaching, learning, and performance assessments were also subsets of, or had subsets of this public sharing around a campfire. And as you move around these scaffolds that were optional, they were on different pages because some students found too much information not easing their stress but actually increasing the confusion. And these included annotated models, podcasts. I did have common Q&As from the drop-ins, and I had questions and answers to that provided on a different page. And that guided brainstorming and reflecting that happened in the watering hole. It was timed. People had to come with their purpose ahead of time. They had to come with their questions, and they liked the fact that it was quick. It had a particular short end. They knew they could jump in and out. They could leave before the 20 minutes or drop in a little bit later, but they couldn't start in on the conversation if those questions had already been asked as it had started. So what did we end up with? I had a reduction in transactional distance, and I had a significant increase in performance assessment satisfaction and academic outcomes. The graphic on the screen shows that the impact on course design can be fluid, albeit with an overarching organised framework that provides safety and clarity and consistency from woe to go. What it did do was it stopped those troughs and peaks that we get with participation over in coursework, and particularly around assessment time. It created an ongoing, more consistent coursework participation across the semester. There is so much more I could say beyond 20 minutes here, but the impact in the course design can be read in further detail in my accepted paper. That's a part of the presentation. Or please email me at catherine.bates@uts.edu.au. I'm happy to talk with you about that further. I'd love to share my experiences and your experiences with me about how we can make really effective e-learning performance assessments. And this coursework has been an extreme success with high student outcomes and course satisfaction. Thanks for listening to the end.